actually remember this, my father packing and my brother like holding onto his leg and just screaming. And the look in my father's eyes, I could never forget that look all through my life. As my mother told us that my father didn't want us, I always knew she was lying because I remembered his eyes.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back for episode 29. My guest today resides in the Pacific Northwest. She's an author, artist, and podcaster. Her podcast is called Survivor Voices. She herself is a survivor of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, as she grew up in a cult. Through her podcast and other work, she stands beside abuse survivors and wants them to know that they're not alone. You can find her artwork and her book Cult Child, in addition to her other writings, on her website at Kocsis.com. As you can imagine, in discussing her upbringing in a cult, we get into some difficult subjects. She briefly discusses animal sacrifice that occurred within the cult, and she also spends some time discussing the mental, physical, and sexual abuse that occurred at this cult. She doesn't go into too much detail, but these subjects are discussed. So if this is something that might be difficult for you to listen to, or if this might be a trigger for you, I just wanted to let you know before the episode began. Being raised in a cult, she endured some of the most difficult things a child could experience growing up. She's courageous for speaking out so candidly about these issues, and it's wonderful to see all the work she's doing to bring awareness to cults and to stand with and support fellow cult and abuse survivors. Without further delay, here's my interview with Vennie Kocsis. Vennie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, and I appreciate you coming on to tell your story.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit before we jump into that about what you're working on. It looks like you have books and a blog, and there's some other stuff you've been working on. So I'd actually love to just hear about that to start off the interview.
Sure. I wrote a book entitled Cult Child, and it's the story of my childhood growing up in a fundamentalist cult. First in Massachusetts, and then we were transferred to Alaska. I also have a gratitude journal called Becoming Gratitude, which is a really simple way for someone to explore mindfulness and gratitude through like using all of your senses. And then the other thing that I have is a book of poetry, which really coincides with my novel. A lot of it was written while I was writing my novel. So I have those, and you can find all of those on my website, which is VennieKocsis.com. And I also have a podcast, Survivor Voices, where I provide a platform for other child abuse survivors of all kinds of abuse, institutionalized abuse, cults, to come and share their story and what they're doing. So those are my main projects. And I'm also trying to get to Alaska next year. We're going to hold an educational cult conference there. And so I have a GoFundMe, which is gofundme.com/Survivor Voices, for myself and my best friend, who's my safe person as well, to go up and attend this conference and also present there to try to educate the locals on the cult issue up there.
Wow. So that's a cult conference in Alaska?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, in Fairbanks.
Okay, interesting. There's so much I want to ask you about, but I'm going to try to stick to the story.
Okay.
I'm going to get sidetracked pretty easily, I think. First thing I generally like to ask people is just if someone has deconverted like yourself, a lot of times people say, well, what do you, are you religious, or what do you consider yourself? How would you answer that question?
That I hate to be labeled, that I don't want to be put into a group, that I'm an individual with my own DNA, my own cell movement, and I want to be allowed to be that individual. So I don't identify with any group.
So why don't we just talk about your kind of how Christianity influenced your childhood? So just the early years.
Well, my mother was raised Pentecostal, so she had those roots in her. She got married very young to my father, who was in the Navy, and kind of got wild and loose and left religion behind, and was having quite a great life. I have an older brother and sister. Long story short, my father was on the crew who designed the F-14. So we were in San Diego. He was working at Miramar, and there was a group out of Hemet, California, and one of the women, who was the wife of one of my father's naval friends, had known my mother for many years. So it's important to me that people understand that the process of being lured into a cult is actually often quite slow. Uh, I was born in 69. And so at that time, I was a baby, 1, 2, and 3. And through those years, my mother was first attending Bible study at a home, you know how that goes,
Yeah.
right? Come to my Bible study. And of course, my father was gone a lot, being locked down to do testing. You couldn't leave the base for weeks. So I think she found camaraderie there. Other women who understood her struggles as a military wife, things like that. And then once she was vetted, right, through that Bible study process and she'd gone enough, then she was invited to church.
Mm.
So it was that slow process, and I don't have a lot of recollection until the church part of it. And from there,
So that was in San Diego. So did you guys, you said you ended up in Massachusetts at some point.
yeah. So when she started going to the church, that is when the apocalypse, end of the world message really started getting pounded home to her.
Mm.
So we're talking 72. So
Okay.
thinking of the political issues at the time, the Cold War, Gorbachev is in power, the Russians are coming, the Vietnam War has ended or is on, still in that verge. It was very like kind of a hippie era. So of course they're preaching to my mother that that's all evil. The world is ending. Let's get our families to the woods, to some communes where they will be safe and where we also will be gathered as Christians together. So when the rapture
Mm.
happens, God only has to hit one spot at a time because all the Christians are gathered there. It's not funny, but it kind of is when you think about the ridiculousness of the concept.
Right. That's
But
really
that
funny.
is how it began, and then it gets deeper because they had different types of compounds. Some of them were called deliverance
Oh
farms.
my gosh. That's so creepy.
So it was so creepy. Um, you would be sent to a deliverance farm if you were like my mother and you were overweight. She had a demon of gluttony. So she needed to go to a deliverance farm to be delivered of that demon. And in Ware, Massachusetts, I won't go into detail. I do write it out in my book, but some
Sure.
very horrific abuses happened. The doctrine that Sam Fife used to raise children, it's very macabre. I have these PDFs of his sermons. He believed in spanking babies and training them at a very young age not to cry, that a baby was born into sin with a defiled and evil soul. And it was the responsibility of the parent to cleanse that baby from that evil and reform that child into the likeness of God. And so crying, he taught, was the baby being selfish. That's how deep the sickness of his belief went.
Jeez. That's horrible.
It really was. And, I've been asked so many times, like, why would your mother take you there? And I never was able to really discuss this with my mother. After 11 years, the narcissism was very deep in her. And
Mm.
I'm sure the denial, men, I'm sure that was her way of coping. I don't think she knew the horror she was going to. I think that not until we were there did it set in. And it's kind of like going somewhere and now you're there, you can't escape. You're
Yeah.
into,
Yeah.
so it's that for her.
It's progressive. It's not like all of a sudden they're like, "Hey, we're in a cult. You want to join?" I mean, the way
Right.
the way you kind of talked about it. They go to a Bible study for a while, and then the people who were leading the Bible study can kind of feel them out a little bit and see, are they going to be a good fit or not. And of
Right.
course, if they're susceptible maybe to being influenced, then they invite them to church. And then next thing you know, you're at a deliverance farm.
Yes. So those 4 years were very horrible. Another thing about this cult is that, they very much, Sam was a demonologist, and he has this weird quote in that sermon about, if you don't beat your child will hate you because you've opened him up to the 28 demons. I'm doing research to try to figure out like who the 28 demons are and like how did he get to that number? I haven't found it yet, or any theory of 28 demons even in the Bible. But that was his whole like message, that if you don't do this horrific punishment of your children, they'll hate you later in life.
Wow.
Then the state of Alaska decided that in 1979 they would begin to pay out dividends to its residents for the pipeline, the gas pipeline. So in 77, Sam Fife's frontmen, Doug McLean and George Harris, they began to buy up parcels of land. And they ended up establishing, at the time, about 6 compounds in Alaska, where they moved the bulk of their members from the lower 48 up there.
Wow.
78 would have established their residency. In 79, the kickbacks began, and I recall, my mom standing in line to sign off on her Alaska dividend papers and then standing in line to sign off on her check.
Wow.
So they took, it was a cult. All the money went to the cult, everything.
Wow. So, so it was around 1979 that you guys moved up to Alaska?
We got to Alaska in 77. And so from 70, you had to be there a year to establish a residency, so that in 79, when those dropped, we had the residency to file for them.
Yeah. Wow.
So by that time, I was 7 years old.
Okay. Wow. So it's just your mom. Now your dad was in the military. So did he join you later, or was it just you and your mom and your siblings?
My dad told me, I finally contacted my father when I began to write my book in 2007. And he said it was a very slow change at the house, that my mother's behavior changed. Then, he'd come home and she'd be gone for the weekend, I believe probably at the church place.
Wow.
Then he, because again, he would be locked down doing this testing, and they lock him down for 4, 5, 6 weeks sometimes.
Wow.
That's how we lost custody, right? They asked him, how are you going to raise your kids if you're, doing this? And he said the last time that he came to the house, she had consolidated me, my brother, my sister into one bedroom. And literally there was like 10 cult members living in the house.
Whoa.
I actually remember this, my father packing and my brother like holding onto his leg and just screaming. And the look in my father's eyes, I could never forget that look all through my life. As my mother told us that my father didn't want us, I always knew she was lying because I remembered his eyes. That's hard for me, that he would be back for us. But then the cult crippled him financially. They paid for all of my mother's court costs. They flew in my uncle, who didn't know anything, who hadn't been in contact with my mother for years, to be a character witness for her. They just bankrupted my father until he didn't even have money to exercise his rights for visitation.
Wow. Because you guys had moved away, so...
And my mother gave him an ultimatum and was like, you either come with us or we get divorced. And my dad was like, we're getting divorced. But my brother does remember that he would call the compound in Massachusetts, the first place we were at. So my brother was 9, my sister was 7, and I was 3 when my mom took us in. And they would have, the first compound we lived on had electricity. And they would call, and my father would get to talk to us, but there were elders and stuff in there. So everything was monitored. every portion of your day was monitored.
What's so scary to me when I hear that is if your dad wanted, like, he's trying to call you, he wants to stay in contact with his kids, of course, and I mean, any normal person would think, okay, maybe in a month or two I can visit, but when you're in a cult like that, they control everything, they monitor everything, they could keep him from calling you, they could just say, they could not answer, or they could say,
Right.
they're not here, and then he loses all contact with his whole family. It could happen so easily.
Yeah, when they moved us up to Alaska, right after we got there, we had to fly down to California. And my mother was really grumbling, and, they had that whole the devil's army is messing with you, your father is testing me. And, it was just that diatribe of anything outside the cult being of the devil. And he's forcing visitation on me, and we have to fly down there, and this is ridiculous. And I remember her diatribe. And I would later find out that actually the judge required that we were present because the reason why we went to California was not for visitation. It was the final court hearing of who got custody of us. So the judge required that the children be, me, my brother, and sister, in California. In case custody was granted to my father, he could take us at that time.
Wow.
But my mother never told us that. And so that was the last time that I saw my father. And then he did send a welfare worker once out to the compound when I was maybe around 11.
Wow.
So he tried. He really did in many ways. But I also think he was, emotionally really defeated.
Yeah, totally. I mean, lost his family, basically.
Yeah, he did.
So what happened when the welfare worker came out?
Well, we were taken to a meeting. You couldn't come out to the compound without a meeting. So there's mistake number one. She should have never warned them she was coming. She should have just come out there and said, I want to see these kids. But that's not what happened.
Yeah.
They called the compound. They set up a meeting. And so we were called into a meeting, my sister and I. They'd never tell you, you better not say A, B, C, and D. The conversation went like this. Your dad is testing your mother, and this is a time for you girls to really do something good for God and protect your mother and pass this test. They love bombed us. So when she came and was asking me questions like, was I okay? Was I happy there? And I really lay this out in my book too, where your mind is screaming one thing. Out of fear, too, of, okay, if I tell her the truth that I've been molested, beaten, this is how I'm living, and she doesn't take me, I have to stay here.
Wow.
2, I'm going to betray my mother because I had horrible Stockholm syndrome. And, I've got to do this for God, even though the whole time I was there, I always questioned the existence of God as a child.
Wow.
Like I could never get the tongues, right? I never got the tongues. So I was like, why don't I get the tongues? And that's a self-esteem issue, right? You don't get the tongues. So you're like, why doesn't God give me the tongues? I couldn't even mimic the tongues. I still can't mimic them. Have you ever tried to do it?
I faked it for I thought I was doing it, but I faked it for I was in high school, and I probably faked it for a few months or something, and then it just didn't sit right, and I stopped. So, but yeah, for a period of time in my life.
Did you feel it?
Well, no, I mean, you think you're trying to get yourself caught up in this emotional state, where you're just you're so close to God, and you're just trying to get close, and then it's just supposed to flow out of you, And so that's kind of, I went through that for a short period of time in my life. But then it was kind of I actually quickly went from Pentecostal stuff to, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but there was a show called The Bible Answer Man. And he was real apologetic and defending the faith with logic and reason. And I started to go away from the kind of emotional Pentecostal stuff over to that. So that kind of drew me away from that. So I wasn't in the charismatic stuff for a super long time.
I'd say that the theology of the cult was a combination of definitely Jehovah's Witness and Pentecostal, because we didn't celebrate any birthdays or holidays or anything like that.
Wow.
And even really occultism as well, because there was some ritualistic things. When Sam Fife was alive, he was a very Old Testament preacher. And if anybody's read the Old Testament, it's quite macabre.
Yeah.
And they believe, God sending Abraham to kill his child, lots, having sex with his daughters. There's incest in the Old Testament. So all of these theologies he defended, or his rituals he defended with his theologies. I'll give you an example. In Ware, Massachusetts, there's a story in the Bible where they paint blood around the door. Because God, right, the angel of death is coming over I believe, the Egyptians, and the oldest son will be taken.
Yeah.
Do you remember the story?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so they did that actual ritual. Now, I don't recall if they used real blood. I'm going to say yes, they did, because I was privy to animal sacrifice in the name of God.
Right.
And this is something that's important to me that people understand, is that sacrifice has been mainly attributed to Satanism, and that is a farce. Sacrifice is so prevalent in Christianity, along with cannibalism. Look at communion. But I laid in bed, and I remember I'm laying in my bunk because we were all separated, and I remember thinking, I hope they painted my brother's door.
Oh my gosh, that's so scary.
Because he's the oldest, and the angel of death will take him. And then I remember, I think I may have seen him the next day at the lunch, because we were all in classification units. So you had to stay in your line. I wasn't allowed to talk to my sister or my brother or even my mother.
Whoa.
In those first 4 years. And I remember seeing him and going, okay, God didn't. Yeah, it was that deep.
So you spent 4 years in the Alaska compound?
In the Massachusetts one.
Okay, 4 years in the Massachusetts compound.
Mm-hmm.
And take me through like an average day, just like general big picture kind of, like what was your schedule like? Like you wake up in the morning and...
In Massachusetts, I have very, very scattered memories because the abuse was so intense. But I have enough memories to have an idea of what my schedule may have been like. I recall them getting us up definitely probably around 5 in the morning. We had vast fields, so they would have us children doing tasks like picking grubs off the bottom of the potato leaves. And so we were definitely worked. I don't recall going to school. I may have, but I don't have recollection of that. You went to meals, you stayed quiet, you just were, you had a handler on you constantly, a monitor on you constantly. So an average day like that would have been very regimented.
And you said that they kept you separate, basically? Or like how did how did they separate you?
They classified us by age. So my mother, now, they didn't do this to every family. I was later to find out, when you're in it, you think that it's happening to everybody. But I was later to find out that some families who had a father, so there was a married couple, they had it a little bit better. It was almost like the male figure being there was a protective stance for the family. So the single moms with kids were the bottom of the totem pole and the easiest to abuse and use. Yeah. So my mom was stuck in this room with the other fat women, because they all had to sit at a table together and their food rationed.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. It is. It's people look at me and go like, I can't wrap my head around this. And I'm like, neither can I. And I lived it.
Yeah.
And then I was in probably an age group up until maybe about 7 or 8 years old. And then there was another middle group, and then that my sister was in, and then like a teenage group.
Okay.
And then the boys were all housed together. And I mean, to tell my brother's story, it's just more than the brain can handle.
Wow. Well, what are some of the things that you remember most about being in that Massachusetts compound?
Sexual molestation, hours and hours and hours of sermons.
Wow.
Demon possession, exorcisms. some faded memories of rituals at night. My sister remember it's interesting. My sister will hold a part of a memory and I'll hold the other part. I'll give you an example. I remember a goat sacrifice. I'll try to be as gentle as I can
Yeah.
here. But for me, that was not anything bad, right? We were doing something good for God. Why they used the children, I don't know. I don't understand
Yeah.
that. Maybe for the innocence of the energy, if we're looking at it from an occult perspective
Mm-hmm.
of gifting to God kind of thing. And my sister remembers the layout where the actual altar building was. And I remember building the altars with the stones. I don't have one good memory from Massachusetts, not one. It was horrible.
Who was doing the sexual molestation? Was it like, I'm guessing, the leaders?
Yeah, yeah. My main memory is the leader was Wassel Banaszak was his name, and he's passed away now. It's very interesting. He would come and take a girl for story time. And I remember thinking, I was probably about 4 or 5. Well, why don't I get to go for story
Oh
time?
my gosh.
I'm not special enough to go. He never asks me. So then when it's finally my turn, I'm excited, of course, in the beginning.
Right.
But then you come to understand that it's not the story time you think it
It's
is.
kind of like, I don't know if this is technically grooming, but it reminds me of grooming.
Oh, it's absolutely grooming. Absolutely. Hmm. I remember at first he did. He read a story. He read me a story. You were alone in his room with him. I remember the layout of his room. I remember the braided rug. So he would sit you on his lap, read you the story. And so I remember the first few times it was just story time. He was getting comfortable with me. And then little things would happen like tickling. People don't realize that a
Yeah.
lot of molesters use tickling as a grooming method and a way to get a child familiar with them touching their body.
Wow.
Because tickling's supposed to be fun. I am not a fan of tickling. I think it's horrible to tickle a child as that child screams, no, please stop. They want you to stop. So he did that type of stuff and then it moved on from there. So it was definitely a procession of weeks and weeks that would go by. But he took one child at a time that I remember. It was like, okay, she went and then she's not going to story time anymore. And then she's going to story time.
Did the other leaders know what was happening, do you think?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Well,
So I'm
I
just
can.
wondering how they reconcile that with being so Christian, you know?
Oh, I'll tell you. They believed that pedophilia was a demon spirit that could be cast out. If you were gay, that was a demon spirit that could be cast out. Everything was a demon spirit that could be cast out. So pedophiles were welcome to the cult for healing. And for
Yeah.
a pedophile, what better place to be than in a compound in the woods with a bunch of kids?
Jeez. So horrible.
It is very horrible.
So your time in Massachusetts was about, you said, about 4 years.
Hmm.
Before we move on to kind of the next phase in your life, was there anything else significant about that time that you wanted to mention?
I just remember that we were all brought together into the yard, and that was the first time I'd been with my mother. And I was little, so everything was at, kind of knee height. Then I got like tucked in her skirt. I remember like clinging to her. And they told us that some people from the government were coming, the devil's army was coming, and we were bringing the families back together. I mean, they basically were putting the families together as a visual for them.
Wow.
I do remember the cars. Those old school, like 70s box style, like black government type cars, like
Yeah.
F might have drove. And then I don't remember packing anything like that. The next memory I have were landing in the Alaska airport.
Wow.
And I remember that because of the big stuffed bear that's in that airport was like enormous to me.
So they've moved all these families now out far, far away in Alaska in the wilderness. I mean, just as far as from civilization as they can get, probably.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
And the compound I was on in Alaska is still there today.
no way. What, I
Oh,
mean, is there anything going on there? Is it
oh yeah.
still a cult?
Oh, yes. They're more
Wow.
powerful, I think, than they ever were. They have 22 compounds that we've tracked worldwide.
That's crazy. Who tracks this kind of thing? I mean, other than just like folks like yourself who were interested in bringing awareness.
Folks like myself and
Yeah.
a couple of my other cult survivors, one who just got off the cult recently, like within the last 6 years,
Wow.
who's an excellent researcher. We have a dossier of information on this cult, and its roots are quite interesting and quite deep. Now, it's odd to me that they chose Delta Junction to build all these compounds around there. They pretty much own the town of Delta. It's like the FLDS in Utah,
Hmm.
where you can't trust the troopers. You don't know who's involved, who's friendly, and who's not. And also around all of that is Poker Flats Research Center, Harp Research Center, Fort Greely, Fort Wainwright, and they often took us to Fort Greely. So there's these weird kind of connections there as well, and we're not real sure what that is, but it's just an oddity.
Wow.
I don't like to
Uh
assume or
huh. What?
try to fill in gaps that I don't know,
Right.
but
What's the name of the cult? Does it have a name?
at the time it was called the Sam Fife's Move of God.
Okay.
Now what they do is they've dissected into these different entities. So say I wanted to sue them, I'd have to name probably about 15 defendants.
Wow.
But
So they
if you
branched
look at
off.
their websites, you can weave the web. You can see their convention schedule has all the compounds on it. You can see the history of Whitestone showing Doug McLean. Oh, well, Doug McLean, he bought the land for my compound. So see, you can weave the web if you look deep enough of
Yeah.
the connections. Yeah.
Holy smokes. So you get to Alaska. What are some of your earliest first memories when you get there?
When we first got there, we spent a couple months in a tent, and then they moved us up to the top of this building they called the Tabernacle. And we had rooms up there, and I was molested up there. There was an old man named Bryce. He definitely groomed as well because we weren't allowed to have suites and stuff like that in our room, but he was.
Yeah, that's
Right?
yeah.
See, those types of things. Why did he get to have tins of cookies? So that's just weird to me, Steve. Like, if we'd have been caught with something like that, we'd have been in trouble. And then finally, they moved us into a cabin. Life was very regimented, a lot of beatings. There was one woman who used to beat me all the time.
And so your
Especially,
mom was okay with that?
yeah, I
It
mean,
was just
all the
accepted.
parents were. You went to serve. It was just by that time a part of the culture.
Yeah.
By that time, we'd been in what we're on our 5th year. For her, for her mind, she's actually really on like her seventh, 8th year of mind control
Yeah.
through this cult. Yes, there'd be services. We'd have services going where they moved the tables away and you just sat on the benches. And still, they were practicing things with even the babies, spanking them, covering their mouths to train them not to cry. Sometimes if a baby cried during a service, the mother was required to take that child out and get that child quiet because that child was disrupting the service.
Wow.
Now, Sam Fife died in 1979,
Oh.
and he preached this message that if he ever died, that was an indication that the world was going to
Oh
end.
my goodness.
Well, the world didn't end. So for about a month, there was this weird, shifty confusion going on. Like everybody's waiting for the end of the world to drop. But then the longer time goes on and it doesn't happen, now people maybe are starting to kind of remember their critical thinking a little bit. So they appointed a man named Buddy Cobb to take Sam's place, and he pretty much got everybody's minds back under control.
Wow.
He was a pretty wicked damn man himself. Now, I do have to say, it was an interesting shift. Like before Sam died, you better not miss a meal. If you missed a meal, you better have an explanation. After Sam died, the rules changed depending on what the elders wanted. If, like, for instance, the elders wanted to be able to take their meals back to the cabin. They didn't want to be required to sit at meals. So they changed that rule.
That's really
right? Because that accommodated them.
Yeah.
But other things were like having to wear skirts. I've read the Bible at least 4 times before I was 14. They made us memorize the begats. You know what those are like. That's just ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so.
Yes, it's like the most horrible thing ever. And that I had to do before Sam Fife died. And I really remember that because the woman, Marilyn Hagley, who was my teacher, you had to like say them correctly or you get beat, and then you had to go memorize them. And like you had all, so like there was this nervousness, like I got to say them right this time or I'm going to get my butt beat.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, you're terrified.
After Sam Fife died, the last beating I remember is from her. My mother had gone into town, and I don't even remember why she beat me. But it was my sister who heard me screaming in the schoolhouse. Okay, she's beating me in front of other kids in my class. And the door was locked. And they used very thick paddles. If you remember those old school paddles that you got licks with in high school, that's what you got beat with. And so all I remember is a man like literally kicking open the door. My sister screaming at her to stop, stop, stop. He grabbed me and had me carrying me. And as far as my sister can remember, my mother basically told her, if you ever touch my daughter again, like, we're going to have a problem. So I think at that time, my mother was starting to kind of stand up, but she had her own issues too. Like she would backhand you. It was kind of like, don't you hit my kid, but I can kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and even, I mean, that was in the 70s or the 80s?
By that time, we'd gotten into, well, that happened right after Sam Fife died. So I'm going to say that's probably about like 1980.
Yeah, I mean, even back then, like spanking was not uncommon. It was pretty, you know, and so, and like, yeah, I don't know. Domestic violence wasn't what it is today. You know, people back then didn't consider that kind of thing domestic violence, you know.
Well, yeah, and the fact that one thing I really focus in on, especially when talking with religious parents, I will attack religion because I hate religion. I think it is the most mass mind control ever enacted on humanity. But if I have a chance to A, talk about religion, or B, talk about keeping a child safe, I'm going to say to them, every time you lean that child over your lap and you land blows to their sacrum, I want you to know that when they grow up, their hips are going to ache them all the time. You're creating spinal issues, and you are affecting their nervous system and their spinal cord. So reaching them through a scientific can work, right? If they're not faith healy type of religious people.
Yeah, if they're open to hearing, you know,
the medical side of it.
Yeah. Wow. So your mom, obviously there was a limit to allowing child abuse. You know, you're still her child, and she didn't want to see you get, you know, the hell beat out of you, you know?
Honestly, knowing my mother and being honest that she was really formed into a pretty hardcore narcissist, I'm going to say that her doing that was more of getting pleasure out of getting to enact her own control and tell somebody this is what you're going to do, more than it was caring about the well-being of her daughter.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Sense?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
No, totally. Yeah, for the narcissist, it's always about them. It's their child. You're beating their child. It's not about you being heard. It's about them having control, and it's their ego kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yes. It was like, I'm going to win this little battle with this woman. Because before that, she never had a problem with her, right? Because she couldn't really say anything before Sam Fife died. And then there was still that element, that core element of can't trust, be careful what you say. You know, they always keep that going. That's how the mind control works. But before Sam Fife died, it was so methodical and sadistic and a part of the religion that kind of flipped a little bit, and they began to preach even more into the New Testament more. Like God's forgiven you and Jesus died for your sins and those types of things.
This could just be my perception, but I feel like the 70s was like, and maybe the 80s were like, that's like when cults were thriving in America. I don't know. It just seems that way. Like Jim Jones and I don't know. Just, it feels like that. Like I tend to think there aren't as many now. I could totally be wrong. And you having said that there's, stuff's going up in Alaska still. That's it's mind blowing that kind of thing still happens.
Well, it's a very quiet. This cult is, as I can see, the most quiet and hidden cult in America and one of the most powerful. Now, we could talk about the word cult, and cult experts would probably hate me for this. I'm pretty adamant about it. The word cult derives from the Catholics, from the Latin, and it just means to worship. So it could be said anybody who worships anything is exuding cult behavior.
Yeah.
Anybody who's a part of groupthink who worships an entity is part of a cult. So then they start to say, well, are cults bad or are they good? Well, I mean, in my opinion, they're all bad because you're believing in something outside of your own existence.
It's like a degree of bad, it's like...
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the bad sliding scale.
Right. Well, how long were you in the cult in Alaska then?
I was there for 7 years until I was 14, and something happened with my sister. I don't want to give away the ending of my book, just in case someone grabs it. And we were banished.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you have a deconversion story you would like to share, email us at steve@vodpodcast.com.
Thanks again for listening. Be sure to tune in for part 2 of Vennie's story next week.